Year 6, we're reading chapter 36 today. I'm not going back, said Zero. You've got nowhere else to go, said Stanley. Zero said nothing. You'll die out here, said Stanley. Then I'll die out here. Stanley didn't know what to do. He'd come to rescue Zero, and instead he'd drunk the last of his sploosh. He looked off into the distance. I want you to look at something. I'm not. I just want you to look at that mountain up there. See the one that has something sticking up out of it? Yeah, I think. What does it look like to you? Does it look like anything? Zero said nothing, but as he studied the mountain, his right hand slowly formed a fist. He raised his thumb. His eyes went from the mountain to his hand, then back to the mountain. They put 4 of the unbroken jars in the burlap sack in case they might be able to use them. Stanley carried the sack and Zero held the shovel. I should warn you, Stanley said, I'm not exactly the luckiest guy in the world. Zero wasn't worried. When you spend your whole life living in a hole, he said, the only way you can go is up. They gave each other the thumbs up sign, then they headed out. It was the hottest part of the day, and Stanley's empty canteen was still strapped around his neck. He thought back to the water truck and he wished he'd at least stopped and filled his canteen before running off. They hadn't gone very far before Zero had another attack. He clutched his stomach as he let himself fall to the ground. Stanley could only wait for it to pass. The sploosh had saved Zero's life, but was it now destroying him from the inside? He wondered how long it would be before he too felt the effects. He looked at Big Thumb. It didn't seem any closer than when they first started out. Zero took a deep breath and managed to sit up. Can you walk? Stanley asked him. Just give me a second, Zero said. He took another breath, then, using the shovel, pulled himself back to his feet. He gave Stanley the thumbs up sign and they continued. Sometimes Stanley would try to go for a long while without looking at Big Thumb. He'd make a mental snapshot of how it looked, then wait maybe 10 minutes before looking at it to see if it seemed closer. It never did. It was like chasing the moon. And if they ever reached it, he realised they'd still have to climb it. I wonder who she was, said Zero. Who? Mary Lou, said Zero. Stanley smiled. I guess she was once a real person on a real lake. It's hard to imagine. I bet she was pretty, said Zero. Somebody must have loved her a lot to name a boat after her. Yeah, said Stanley. I bet she looked great in a bathing suit, sitting there in the boat while her boyfriend rowed. Zero used the shovel as a third leg. 2 legs weren't enough to keep him up. I got to stop and rest, he said after a while. Stanley looked at Big Thumb. It still didn't look any closer. He was afraid if Zero stopped, he might never get started again. We're almost there, he said. He wondered which was closer, Camp Green Lake or Big Thumb. I really have to sit down. Just see if you can go a little. Zero collapsed. The shovel stayed up a fraction of a second longer, perfectly balanced on the tip of the blade, and then it fell next to him. Zero knelt, bent over with his head on the ground. Stanley could hear a very low moaning sound coming from him, and he looked at the shovel and couldn't help but think that he might need it to dig a grave. Zero's last hole. And who'll dig a grave for me, he thought. But Zero did get up, once again, flashing a thumbs up sign. Give me some words, he said weakly. It took Stanley a few seconds to realise what he meant. Then he smiled and said, R-U-N. Zero sounded it out to himself. Run, run, run. Good. F-U-N. Fun. The spelling seemed to help Zero. It gave him something to concentrate on besides his pain and his weakness. It distracted Stanley as well. The next time he looked up at Big Thumb, it really did seem closer. They quit spelling words when it hurt too much to talk. Stanley's throat was dry. He was weak and exhausted. Yet as bad as he felt, he knew that Zero felt 10 times worse. As long as Zero could keep going, he could keep going too. It was possible, he thought, he hoped, that he didn't get any of the bad bacteria. Zero hadn't been able to unscrew the lid. Maybe the bad germs couldn't get in either. Maybe the bacteria were only in the jars, which opened easily, the ones he was now carrying in his sack. What scared Stanley the most about dying wasn't his actual death. He figured he could handle the pain. It wouldn't be much worse than what he felt now. In fact, maybe at the moment of his death, he'd be too weak to even feel pain. Death would be a kind of relief. What worried him most was the thought of his parents, not knowing what had happened to him, not knowing whether he was alive or dead. He hated to imagine what it would be like for his mother and his father, day after day, month after month, not knowing, living on false hope. For him, at least, it would all be over. For his parents, the pain would never end. He wondered if the warden would send out a search party to look for him. It didn't seem likely. She didn't send anyone to look for Zero, but no one cared about Zero. They simply destroyed his files. But Stanley had a family. She couldn't pretend he was never there. He wondered what she'd tell them, and when. "What do you think's up there?" Zero asked. Stanley looked to the top of Big Thumb. Probably an Italian restaurant," he said. Zero managed to laugh. "I think I'll get a pepperoni pizza and a root beer," said Stanley. "I want an ice cream sundae," said Zero, "with nuts and whipped cream and bananas and hot fudge sauce." The sun was almost directly in front of them. The thumb pointed up towards it. They came to the end of the lake. Huge white stone cliffs rose up before them. Unlike the eastern shore, where Camp Green Lake was situated, the western shore did not slope down gradually. It was as if they'd been walking across the flat bottom of a giant frying pan, and now they had somehow to climb up out of it. They could no longer see Big Thumb. The cliffs blocked their view, and the cliffs also blocked out the sun. Zero groaned and clutched his stomach, but he remained standing. "I'm all right," he whispered. Stanley saw a rut, about a foot wide and 6 inches deep, running down a cliff. On either side of the rut were a series of ledges. "Let's try there," he said. It looked to be about a 50-foot climb straight up. Stanley still managed to hold the sack of jars in his left hand as he slowly moved up from ledge to ledge, crisscrossing the rut. At times, he had to use the side of the rut for support in order to make it to the next ledge. Zero somehow stayed with him. His frail body trembled terribly as he climbed the stone wall. Some of the ledges were wide enough to sit on, and others stuck out no more than a few inches, just enough for a quick step. Stanley stopped about 2/3 of the way up, on a fairly wide ledge, and Zero came up alongside him. "You okay?" Stanley asked. Zero gave the thumbs up sign, and Stanley did the same. He looked above him. He wasn't sure how he'd get to the next ledge. It was 3 or 4 feet above his head, and he didn't see any footholds. He was afraid to look down. "Give me a boost," said Zero. "Then I'll pull you up with a shovel." "You won't be able to pull me up," said Stanley. "Yeah, I will," said Zero. Stanley cupped his hands together and Zero stepped on his interwoven fingers. He was able to lift Zero high enough for him to grab the protruding slab of rock.